There is a moment in history when everything changes, not slowly, not gradually, but in a single instant, sealed by a single decision. And if you had been standing on the walls of Constantinople on the morning of May 29th, 1453, you would have felt it, you would have heard it, the thunderous roar of the largest cannons the world had ever seen, the screaming of iron tearing through stone that had stood for 1,000 years. And you would have known, with cold certainty in your chest, that someone somewhere had made a choice, and that choice had just ended an empire. But the story of Constantinople's fall does not begin with cannon fire. It does not begin with the young Ottoman Sultan who pressed his armies to the walls of the greatest city in the world. It begins long before that. It begins with a city that once seemed invincible, a people who believed their walls would hold forever, and a series of decisions, each one reasonable in its moment, each one catastrophic in its consequence, that together made the fall of Constantinople not just possible, but inevitable. To understand what was lost, you must first understand what Constantinople was. Not merely a city, not merely a capital. Constantinople was the hinge of the world, built on a narrow triangle of land where Europe meets Asia, where the Bosphorus narrows to a passage barely half a mile wide. The city sat at the crossroads of every major trade route connecting east and west. Silk from China, spices from India, furs from the Russian north, grain from the Black Sea shores, all of it passed through Constantinople. The city was not just wealthy. It was the engine of Mediterranean civilization, the beating heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, the inheritor of Caesar and Augustus, the keeper of Greek philosophy and Christian theology, the place where antiquity met the medieval world and refused to die. At its height, Constantinople was home to perhaps 500,000 souls. Its walls, the Theodosian walls, built in the early 5th century, were the most sophisticated defensive fortification in the ancient world. A double line of stone and mortar, stretching nearly 4 miles across the landward approach, studded with towers every 50 yards, fronted by a wide moat that could be flooded on command. Generation after generation of invaders had thrown themselves at those walls. Visigoths, Huns, Avars, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Russians. Every single one of them had failed. The walls had never been breached from the outside. Constantinople had endured for over 1,000 years, and its people had come to believe, perhaps not unreasonably, that it would endure forever. That belief was the first crack in the foundation, because empires do not fall from the outside alone. They hollow out from within, slowly, over generations, and by the time the enemy arrives at the gates, the walls may still be standing, but the strength behind them is already gone. This is what happened to Byzantium, and the process was long and painful, and in many ways self-inflicted. The Eastern Roman Empire had once stretched from Spain to Mesopotamia, from the Danube to the Sahara. By the middle of the 14th century, it had been reduced to the city of Constantinople itself, a handful of towns in Greece, and a few islands scattered across the Aegean. The great provinces, Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, the Balkans, were gone, lost to the Arabs, to the Turks, to the Crusaders, to the Normans, to rebellion and plague and bankruptcy and civil war. What remained was a ghost of an empire, wearing the costume of its former greatness, and yet Constantinople persisted. The city still stood. The double wall still rose 40 feet above the Golden Horn. The Hagia Sophia still dominated the skyline, its dome a visible declaration that this place mattered, that this civilization was worth preserving. The emperors still held court, the patriarchs still blessed the faithful, and the people of the city, who had survived so much, told themselves that the walls would hold again. But the walls cost money. And money was exactly what the Byzantine Empire no longer had. By the mid-15th century, the imperial treasury was effectively empty. The population of Constantinople had shrunk from 500,000 to perhaps 50,000. Some estimates place it even lower, closer to 40,000. Large sections of the city within the walls had been depopulated, reverting to fields and orchards and small villages separated by stretches of emptiness. The magnificent forums and colonnaded streets of ancient Rome had crumbled. The empire that had once commanded armies of 100,000 men could barely muster 7,000 soldiers to defend its capital. 7,000. Against an Ottoman army that would ultimately number between 80 and 100,000. This was the world into which Constantine the Vim's Palaiologos stepped when he became the last emperor of Byzantium in 1449. He was a capable man by all accounts, a soldier, an administrator, a man who understood the gravity of what he had inherited. He knew the empire was dying. He knew the Ottoman threat was existential. He knew that without help from the West, Constantinople could not survive a determined siege. And so he did what his predecessors had done for 2 centuries. He looked to Rome, not to the city of Rome, which was itself diminished and politically fragmented. He looked to the Pope, because the Pope controlled the spiritual loyalty of Western Christendom. And Western Christendom, the knights of France, the soldiers of Hungary, the fleets of Venice and Genoa, and the Papal States, represented the only military force capable of matching the Ottoman army in the field. The price of that help had always been the same: union of the Eastern and Western churches. The Orthodox East and the Catholic West had been formally separated since the Great Schism of 1054, and the theological and cultural gulf between them was deep. The Orthodox faithful of Constantinople regarded the Latin Church with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. A contempt earned in part by the Fourth Crusade of 1204, when Western Crusaders had sacked Constantinople itself, looting the Hagia Sophia, installing a Latin emperor on the Byzantine throne, and leaving wounds that had never fully healed. But Constantine V had no choice. He needed the West. And so he pursued union. In 1452, the Metropolitan Isidore arrived in Constantinople bearing the terms of the Council of Florence, which had declared a formal reunion of the churches in 1439. Constantine supported the union. He had Isidore read the proclamation of reunion in the Hagia Sophia in December of 1452 in the presence of the imperial court. The reaction was devastating. The people of Constantinople did not want union. The Orthodox clergy, with a few notable exceptions, rejected it with fury. The Grand Duke Notaras, one of the most powerful men in the city, reportedly declared that he would rather see the turban of the Sultan in Constantinople than the cardinal's hat of Rome. Churches were boycotted. Priests who supported the union were threatened. The Hagia Sophia itself was effectively abandoned by the Orthodox faithful after the proclamation. They would not worship in a space that had been tainted by Latin rites. This was not merely a theological dispute. It was a social fracture at the worst possible moment, dividing the population of a city that desperately needed unity. And the help that Constantine had hoped would flow from the West, the armies, the fleets, the men and money and weapons, never came. Not in meaningful quantities, not in time. Why? Because the Western powers were consumed with their own crises. France and England were exhausted from the 100 Years' War, which had only recently ended. The Holy Roman Empire was paralyzed by internal politics. Venice and Genoa were more interested in their commercial relationships with the Ottomans. Yes, they traded with the very empire that was about to destroy Constantinople, than in organizing a crusade. The Pope sent a few hundred soldiers. Venice eventually sent 2 ships. It was a gesture, not a rescue. And the man who needed rescuing knew it. Constantine V knew by the autumn of 1452 that the help was not coming. He knew the numbers. He could see the walls being inspected by Ottoman engineers. He could hear the reports coming in from spies and travelers about the massive army being assembled in Edirne, the Ottoman capital. He knew what was coming. and he chose to stay. This is the decision that history does not always linger on, not because it was the wrong decision, but because it was the only decision that a man of his character could make. Constantine could have fled. He could have negotiated a surrender, as some of his advisors urged. He could have accepted Ottoman suzerainty and preserved himself and his court. The Sultan Mehmed II, who was then only 21 years old but already ruthlessly pragmatic, might have allowed it at a price. But Constantine refused. He chose to fight. He chose to stand behind the walls of Constantinople with 7,000 men and face an army of 100,000. And that choice, that refusal to yield, was both the most heroic thing he ever did and the decision that made the fall of the city absolute, because it meant there would be no negotiated surrender, no peaceful transition, no soft landing. When the walls finally broke, there would be nothing to stop what came next. The man who stood on the other side of those walls was unlike any Ottoman ruler before him. Mehmed II was 21 years old, brilliant, obsessive, and consumed by a vision that had haunted him since childhood: the conquest of Constantinople. He had read the ancient histories. He had studied Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He knew what the city meant. Whoever held Constantinople controlled the straits, controlled the trade routes, controlled the symbolic weight of the city that had called itself the New Rome for 1100 years. Taking Constantinople would not just expand his empire, it would make him the most powerful ruler on earth. He prepared for it with extraordinary methodical precision. In the year before the siege, he ordered the construction of a fortress, Rumeli Hizara, on the European side of the Bosphorus, directly across from an older Ottoman fortress on the Asian shore. Together, the two fortresses effectively cut off Constantinople from the Black Sea, severing the city's supply lines from the north. The construction was completed in 4 months. It was a statement of intent as much as a military asset. The Sultan was coming, and he was cutting off every route of escape or relief before he arrived. Then came the cannons. Mehmed had heard of a Hungarian engineer named Urban, a master of cannon making, who had first offered his services to Constantine XV. Constantine could not afford him. Mehmed could. Urban arrived in the Ottoman court and was given unlimited resources. The cannon he produced for Mehmed was a monster by the standards of the age. A bronze barrel more than 25 feet long, capable of hurling stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds. It took 60 oxen and 200 men to move it. When it was fired at a test range outside Edirne, the sound reportedly shook the ground for miles around and sent people running into the streets in terror, thinking it was an earthquake. This cannon, and the dozens of smaller but still devastating artillery pieces that accompanied it, were the technological key that unlocked Constantinople. The Theodosian walls had been built to resist battering rams, siege towers, and mining. They had never faced sustained artillery bombardment. The principles of their construction, brilliant for their era, offered no defense against the shock of cast-iron balls striking at velocity. And Mehmed knew it. When the Ottoman army arrived outside Constantinople in early April of 1453, the contrast between the two forces was almost surreal. On one side, an army that stretched across the horizon. Infantry, cavalry, engineers, siege specialists, a fleet of warships, and the thundering artillery battery that Urban had built. On the other side, 7,000 defenders stretched across miles of wall, so thinly spread that in places there was barely one man every few yards. Constantine XV organized his defenses with everything he had. The Genoese captain Giovanni Giustiniani Longo arrived with a force of approximately 700 men and became the de facto military commander of the ground defense, a competent, experienced soldier whose presence was a genuine asset. The chain boom across the Golden Horn, a massive iron chain stretched between two towers, successfully blocked the Ottoman fleet from entering the harbor. a crucial defensive achievement that protected the northern walls. The defenders repaired damage to the walls every night, hauling rubble and wooden barricades to fill the gaps torn open by the cannons each day. For weeks, this held. The walls were being battered, but they were holding. The Ottoman attacks were being repulsed. Morale among the defenders, though strained, was intact. The sea walls remained unbreached, and the defenders allowed themselves a small, fragile hope. Perhaps the walls would hold long enough. Perhaps a relief force would come. Perhaps Mehmed would exhaust himself and withdraw, as Ottoman armies had withdrawn from Constantinople before. That hope died on April 22nd. On that night, Mehmed executed one of the most audacious logistical maneuvers in medieval military history. He had his engineers construct a greased wooden roadway across a hill on the northern shore of the Golden Horn, and over it he dragged 70 ships overland from the Bosphorus into the upper harbour. Hauled by oxen, rolled on logs, carried by the labour of thousands of men through the night, the ships appeared in the harbour at dawn, as if by sorcery. The Byzantine defenders on the sea walls stared in disbelief. The Golden Horn, which had been secured, was suddenly full of enemy warships. The defensive perimeter had been doubled. The already impossibly thin line of defenders was now stretched further still, and the psychological impact, the sheer audacity of what Mehmed had done, was devastating. The message was clear. This sultan would not be stopped by walls or chains or the geography of the sea itself. He would find a way. The next weeks were a grinding attrition. The artillery continued to pound the land walls, focusing on a section near the gate of St. Romanus, where the terrain dipped slightly, creating a small valley, the Mesoteikion, where the outer and inner walls were not as well supported by the natural landscape. This section of wall became the focal point of the Ottoman attack, and it was here that the largest of Urban's cannons was aimed, day after day, shattering stone that had stood for 1,000 years. Giustiniani's men repaired. Mehmed's cannons broke. The rhythm continued, and every night as the defenders carried rubble and drove wooden stakes into the rubble fills and prayed for relief, the walls that had never been breached grew a little weaker. There were other failures too. A Venetian captain who had promised to sail for help from the Aegean did nothing for weeks. A Hungarian military force that might have marched to relieve the city never materialized. The promised ships from Venice arrived too late, and in too small a number to matter. One by one, the fragile threads of hope that Constantine had been holding frayed and broke. By late May, the situation was desperate in a way that no amount of courage could disguise. The defenders were exhausted after nearly 2 months of continuous combat and repair work, sleeping in shifts, eating what little remained. Disease had spread. Morale was cracking. Mehmed, meanwhile, had suffered his own frustrations. Several assault attempts had been repulsed with heavy losses, but he had the numbers to absorb those losses. Constantine did not. On May 26th, Mehmed held a war council. Some of his commanders urged patience or a negotiated settlement. Mehmed rejected them. He had been watching the walls. He had been watching the gaps that were now being filled only with wooden barricades and rubble. He had been counting the defenders. He knew the city was at the edge of what it could endure. He ordered a final, all-out assault for the night of May 28th into the 29th. On the evening of May 28th, Constantine V addressed his officers and commanders in the Hagia Sophia. What he said was recorded, or at least remembered, in the accounts of those who survived. He spoke of honor. He spoke of sacrifice. He spoke of the city they were defending, its history, its churches, its people. He spoke of the faith that had sustained it. And he made no promises of survival. He asked only that they fight. He asked them to die, if it came to that, for something worth dying for. Then he knelt and prayed. In the hours before midnight, an extraordinary quiet fell over the Ottoman camp. Mehmed had ordered silence. No drums, no music, no shouting. The vast army prepared in near total darkness. The artillery was loaded. The infantry divisions were arranged in waves. The irregular troops first, to exhaust the defenders, then the Anatolian regulars, and finally the Janissaries, the elite corps of the Ottoman army, the Sultan's own household troops, the best-trained soldiers in the world, held in reserve for the decisive moment. At approximately 1:30 in the morning on May 29, 1453, the Ottoman assault began. The first waves broke against the walls like water against rock. The Byzantines fought with the ferocity of men who knew there was nothing behind them, no reserve, no retreat, no second line of defense. Giustiniani directed the defense at the Mesotikion with everything he had, and for a time the walls held even in the grinding chaos of a night assault. But then everything came apart at once. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, Giustiniani was wounded. The accounts differ on how severely. Some say a crossbow bolt through his armor, some say an arquebus wound. But whatever the cause, he decided to leave the wall. He asked the emperor for the key to a small gate in the inner wall so that he could be carried to a ship in the harbor. Constantine, in what may have been the worst moment of his reign, gave him the key. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Giustiniani's Genoese troops, who had anchored the defense of the Mesotikion, saw their commander carried away. Panic spread. Men began to move toward the gate he had retreated through. The defenders at the most critical point of the wall began to fall back. And then a secondary disaster struck, one of those accidents of history that seem too convenient to be believed, but is confirmed by multiple sources. A small postern gate, the Kerkeporta, a minor door in the wall near the northern end of the land defenses, had been left unlocked. Some sources say it was left open by accident during a sortie when men went out to attack the Ottoman flank and forgot to lock it behind them when they returned. Others suggest it was deliberate sabotage. What is certain is that Ottoman soldiers found it open and poured through. The cry went up, "The Turks are inside the walls." That cry ended everything. Whatever cohesion remained in the Byzantine defense evaporated. Men who had fought through weeks of siege, who had held through countless assaults, now turned and ran. The inner wall, which might still have held, was abandoned. The gates were rushed. The Ottoman army, that vast, patient, disciplined force that had waited for this moment for 7 weeks, flooded into the city. Constantine V, when he understood what was happening, stripped off his imperial regalia. He did not want to be taken alive, not because he feared death, but because he refused to be a prize. He charged into the breaking line with his sword drawn. He was never seen again. His body was reportedly identified later by the purple boots he wore, the imperial purple, the mark of his rank, among the dead in the streets near the broken gate. The last emperor of Byzantium died in the rubble of his walls, fighting. The city fell in the morning hours of May 29, 1453. What followed is documented in the sources with a detail that is painful to read. Mehmed had promised his troops 3 days of plunder, as was the custom of the era. For 3 days, the soldiers moved through Constantinople, taking everything that could be moved. Prisoners were seized for the slave markets. Churches were stripped of their gold and silver and sacred objects. Libraries, the accumulated learning of centuries, the texts of ancient Greece and Rome that had been preserved in Constantinople when they were lost everywhere else, were torn apart, the manuscripts scattered or destroyed. The mosaic saints in the churches of the city stared down at scenes that would have been incomprehensible to those who commissioned them. When Mehmed II himself rode into the city, he reportedly made straight for the Hagia Sophia. He dismounted at the door. He knelt. He picked up a handful of earth and poured it over his head, a gesture of humility, of acknowledgement that even the greatest conquest was as dust before God. Then he entered the church, looked up at the dome that floated above him in the filtered light, and quietly declared that the building would be converted into a mosque. The city that had called itself the New Rome for 1100 years had a new master. The long-term consequences of Constantinople's fall reverberated across the world in ways that are still with us today. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, the gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The trade routes that had connected Europe with Asia through Constantinople were now under Ottoman control. With all the tariffs and restrictions that entailed, European merchants who had depended on those routes for the luxury goods that sustained their economies were suddenly faced with a crisis. The old path to the east was closed, or at least prohibitively expensive. It was this pressure, this desperate need to find a new route to the spices and silks of Asia that helped drive the age of exploration. Portuguese sailors pushed further and further down the coast of Africa, looking for a sea route around the continent. Spanish monarchs funded a Genoese sailor named Columbus, who believed he could reach Asia by sailing west. The world was about to become larger and stranger and more connected in ways that no one in Constantinople on May 29, 1453 could have imagined. The fall also sent a wave of Greek scholars fleeing westward into Italy, carrying with them manuscripts and knowledge that catalyzed the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical learning that would transform European art, science, philosophy, and eventually politics. The fall of one civilization seeded the growth of another. The Ottoman Empire itself, energized by the conquest, went on to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East for the next 4 centuries, shaping the political geography of a region that the world is still arguing about today. Mehmed II, emboldened by what he had achieved, would go on to conquer much of Greece, Serbia, Bosnia, and Crimea. The Ottoman state that Constantine had feared and failed to stop became one of the great powers of the early modern world. And Constantinople, renamed Istanbul by its new rulers, though the old name persisted for centuries in common use, was reborn under Ottoman administration as one of the great cities of the Islamic world. Its churches became mosques, its streets filled with new inhabitants speaking new languages, practicing new faiths. The Hagia Sophia, built as a Christian cathedral in 537 by the Emperor Justinian, prayed in as a church for 9 centuries, converted to a mosque in 1453, converted to a museum in 1934, and converted back to a mosque in 2020, still stands above the Bosphorus, a physical embodiment of all the history that flows through that narrow strait. What does the fall of Constantinople teach us, standing at this distance of more than 5 centuries? It teaches us that no wall is high enough if the will to defend it has already collapsed. It teaches us that a civilization can hollow out from within, slowly and imperceptibly, until only the facade remains, and that the facade, however magnificent, cannot withstand a determined assault. It teaches us that the moment of decision, the hinge on which everything turns, is rarely a single dramatic choice. It is the accumulation of smaller choices, made over years and decades, each one defensible in isolation, each one contributing to the final catastrophe. It teaches us, too, something about the nature of endings. The people of Constantinople did not wake up on May 28, 1453, knowing it was the last day of their world. They woke up and continued to believe, some of them perhaps even in those final hours, that the walls would hold, that help would come, that the empire that had endured for 1,000 years would find a way to endure again. They were wrong, and they were not wrong because they were weak or faithless or foolish. They were wrong because history does not care about longevity. History does not give extra credit for 1,000 years of survival. When the moment comes, it comes. And what matters is not what you have been, but what you are capable of in that moment, with what you have left. Constantine the Things, in the end, gave everything he had. It was not enough, but he gave it. And that is why his name is remembered, and why the story of Constantinople's fall is not simply a tale of defeat, but something more complex, a meditation on courage and loss, on the weight of an inheritance too great for any one generation to carry alone, on the way that empires end, not with a single catastrophic mistake, but with the slow, quiet failure of everything that once made them great. The walls of Constantinople stood for 1,000 years. On May 29th, 1453, they fell in a single morning. One gate left unlocked, one wounded captain carried to safety, 7,000 men against 100,000. The decision was not made in a moment. It was made across a century of decline, a generation of desperation, a reign of impossible choices. And when the last piece fell into place, when the soldiers found the open gate and the cry went up that the Turks were inside, it was not a surprise. It was the arrival of something that had been coming for a very long time. If you find yourself drawn to these stories, to the moments when civilizations tremble and history pivots on the edge of a single hour, then stay with us. There are more empires to trace, more walls to walk, more decisions to understand. Subscribe and keep watching. The past has more to teach us than we have yet been willing to learn.